Hey everybody, welcome. I'm here with Scott, and we're both excited about this topic. We think this is going to be, really of great interest and something that's really going to help you out, particularly if you're at the beginning of your career and you've only experienced maybe one of these scenarios. Then, listening to a couple of guys that have experienced all kinds of various variations on the theme will be of great interest. So specifically what we're talking about when we mean all these variations is working full-time for an employer. I've had some instances recently of working part-time for an employer and then having side hustle, or having nothing but side hustle, or working with folks that help you find gigs, and then there's like overhead involved, or board of advisors, or writing books, authoring courses, trying to do all of them at the same time, right? The whole
we don't
thing.
recommend that one. Just giving that little hint away.
Well, especially at our age, and I think actually it's not inappropriate at some point during the hour that we talk about how these options change in desirability at different stages in your career. I mean, I think age is not disconnected from the topic at all, but we remember when we were young, so we can talk about this stage of our careers as well as earlier times. So as always, I'm always very curious to know who's out there, where you are. I'm in beautiful Las Vegas, which on occasion feels like a second home when you're on the conference circuit. It also implies that I'm on a hotel connection, which I hope won't pose a problem. But when you're gone the entire month, if you want to have a February office hours, it's going to have to be from a hotel room. That's just the way it goes. So we don't know for sure until people introduce themselves, but we're guessing, Scott, that folks probably might be more familiar with me since I'm hosting the event. What I was hoping we could do is start with a little bit of a biographical sketch, but a focus on how these work relationships and their various forms were structured along the way. And then I'm sure we'll dig in deeper to, each of these various scenarios, whether they be contractor, employee, and so on. But why don't you tell everybody a little bit about your adventure thus far?
Sure. Now, do you mind if I include a personal story?
No, I'm pretty much expecting that those are going to be part of the show today.
So my name is Scott Clendanial. Keith inviting me, especially because I am older than dirt. I actually started in the field in analytics all the way back in 1986. And I was definitely a corporate child. And I did corporate work all the way through the VP level at Bank of Hawaii in Hawaii. And then I had a family emergency. And the family emergency made me drop my entire career. So that was 1986 to 1999. Had to leave Hawaii, fly back home to return to Maryland for a personal crisis. And at first, I didn't have any role at all because I had to come back sort of on the fly. And I was in financial services. Most of the major financial services firms had left Baltimore. So I spent a glorious 4 months working as a temp. That was fun. And at that point, I was thinking, all right, this isn't going to work. So what am I going to do? Wonder if anyone's interested in that artificial intelligence stuff I was working on when I was in financial services. And so I left that to go into full-time consulting. Then I went back the corporate route. Then I did both at the same time. So I've been all over the map, and sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly.
What I'm picking up on, Scott, already, and we haven't even talked about all of our work experiences yet, but what I'm picking up on already is a thing that I think we have in common with so many folks like us, is that some kind of life event forced a change. And
yes,
we've just been through a situation where a lot of people were forced through a change, but all of us all at the same time, which was kind of a new thing, called shutdown. But often you don't contemplate doing things a different way, because presumably from undergrad basically until the family emergency, you were a traditional W-2 40-hour a week, at least on paper, 40-hour a week.
Yes.
Standard employee relationship, right? And had other options, had they been appealing until it was forced upon you?
No, not at all.
Even at the moment, it wasn't appealing. It sounds like
not so
totally
much. So I would love to be able to say yes, I had an amazing lifetime plan, and I knew that at this section I was going to go into consulting, and no. That is not what happened at all. And actually, I want to offer a special shout out on this topic while you and I are both chatting, Keith, to the amazing Eric King, who is one of the people who allowed me to do that transition from traditional corporate work into consulting and training. He is an amazing human being and was incredibly kind in giving me that opportunity. And I would not have had that without him. So I thank him. So I spent a lot of time doing consulting for several years, but the life event was absolutely, and not to turn it into too much of a mystery, but I was living in Hawaii. My wife, my son, and I went back to Maryland to visit family. I had to go back early, and then I got a phone call that said, oh, by the way, I've decided I'm divorcing you. And if you ever want to see your son again, you've got to move back to Baltimore. Good luck with that. So that was not an option. So I had a tiny 3-year-old calling me on the phone saying, Daddy, are you done packing my toys yet? Because that's what his mom had told him I was doing in Hawaii. So yeah, that was not optional. Horrible situation. And then trying to figure out how to do consulting and launch a brand new career at the same time. Yeah, not a transition that I made particularly willingly or joyously. Turned out pretty well. I'm happy it happened. But sometimes, folks, as we go through this, be aware that a lot of the traditional ideas that people have may not be true. Entrepreneurship is not always the key to wealth and fame. Corporate work is not always the key to success and long-term employment. And whichever path or combination of any of the three options we're discussing, be aware it's always good to have a plan B. Always, no matter how you decide to design your career, because sometimes life happens.
Well, and another way of stating that is if you have some aspiration, for this whole side hustle thing, whether it's writing a book or authoring a course or whatever. Don't wait until something like what happened to you or shutdown to start working on it. It's always best if you start in your spare time. One is because you have the security of the full-time job, and then you never know when that's going to end, and you don't want to start from scratch. Don't let it just kind of be a dream out there. Chip away at it, because then what will often happen is that some kind of life event will happen, and maybe you don't have the book written, but maybe you have a table of contents, and maybe you have made 2 or 3 LinkedIn connections, to publisher, and then maybe you don't even end up using that publisher, but you've started the journey. So, anyone who's listening to this topic is going to be curious about, starting out in the career. So you've hinted at things. Maybe you could say a little bit more about that. So, and we're not that different in age. So you were starting your career at about the time that I was starting undergrad. And neither of us went the PhD route, which we should probably spend a few minutes talking about, like, why. And
sure,
I'm sure you're as happy as I am that I didn't. But there were times when I thought either that I should, or that I have to, or that I was gonna. And I'm sure you have similar stories. So we'll get to all that. But if you could clarify a little bit about what you studied as an undergrad, and then how that first job got you interested in AI. Because again, and thanks for clarifying the nature of the event, by the way, because if it was something like a family illness, it wouldn't have necessarily required that you permanently move back to the mainland, right? So I think that was important context. So what were you studying? How did you get that first full-time job? And how did that indirectly lead to AI?
Sure. So actually, I studied both undergraduate and for my MBA was strategic planning, which is interesting because it gave me a very different approach one of the things, Keith, that you've seen as much as I have is if you go back 30 years ago, computer scientists did not become data scientists. The running joke I always have is that for the first half of my career, people said, you can't do this because you don't have a PhD in statistics. And the good news is they don't say that anymore. The bad news is instead they say, you can't do this because you don't have a PhD in computer science. And I'm always like, okay, well, year 38 starts in March. So it seems to have worked out okay. But it gave me a very different approach to things in terms of I was always taught, think of it as a case study. What's the problem we're trying to solve? What is success going to look like? How are we going to implement that stuff? Much more than which algorithm am I going to use? And that is not to cast aspersion at all on folks who have developer backgrounds. You guys are amazing and you are critical. All I'm saying is be aware that everyone tends to look for people who look like them. It's just human nature. And sometimes people who become great data scientists don't necessarily have that type of traditional background. I can't tell you how many astronomers I've worked with who are outstanding data scientists, but they didn't look to do this. In terms of the PhD and choosing to do a PhD or not, I was originally going to get my PhD in leadership theory or organizational behavior, and that didn't quite work out. So
that though is probably a better fit in many ways than
yes.
a PhD in stats, because we've both seen those impacts. So briefly on the PhD thing, I contemplated a PhD in psychometrics.
Oh,
which
wow!
Certainly isn't like super close to to data science, but nonetheless, I was interested in psychology, just as you were interested in org behavior. Again, I think this kind of stuff serves us well, frankly, as consultants.
Yeah.
Right? And then you put psychology and stats in a blender, and you kind of get like psychometrics. So at the time, I felt that I needed that for credibility, but 5 years after I decided not to do it, certainly by 10 years after I decided to do it, an advanced degree in stats morphed from, kind of a requirement or a badge of honor to, I don't think I'm exaggerating here, almost a source of suspicion, right? Like, wow, if you're a stats PhD, then you probably don't know your machine learning, because if you spent that much effort, learning stats. And we both,
or worse still, you were an actuary.
Yeah. Well, I mean, any kind of specialty like that, right? And I think we both, one, value stats education because it's important to us in what we do, and we certainly admire folks that have pursued that. But we both experienced the same thing, where in the 90s, you had to have a stats background or you wouldn't seen as competent. And now stats is seen as all but irrelevant, too much so. I mean, the pendulum has swung too much.
Well, and you'll remember back in those days that SAS, in terms of SAS, the software, was not a software program. It was a religion. The folks who grew up on SAS in school, their other software did not exist to them. You were dead to them if you did not use SAS. Open source was not available in those days in terms of the types of applications you're able to make out of Python today. You could not have done back then. Python hadn't been invented yet. And the whole open source community did not exist then. So the world has changed a lot. And Keith, if you don't mind me taking just 1 second, to everybody, regardless of which one you pick, continuous learning, and I hate to sound like a preacher here, but really is important, because however your data science career looks today, it's not going to look that way 5 years from now. So you have to be adaptable. Things that were virtual laws back in the days when we started are not true anymore. And what is true today won't be true 5 years from now.
Yeah, I'm so glad you were explicit about that, because for data scientists that are just starting out, or aspiring data scientists, or maybe folks that are in adjacent fields that are switching over, they might hear that story and their first reaction might be, well, I don't have that to worry about because I'm not I didn't use SAS in school. I used Python, so I'm good. Right? But that's not the moral of the story. The moral of the story is whatever library, like for instance, I will occasionally hear And I believe me, folks, I'm not saying this to endorse or shoot down a brand, right? But I will on occasion overhear folks talking about, let's say, a brand like Alteryx, a bit like I used to hear folks talk about, SaaS within that community. And, more like on the BI, side, certainly, software packages like Tableau have their fans. And these are wonderful software packages. But the point is, there can be a real danger in fact, part of my personal story is going to be probably running the risk of too much of a commitment to one brand. And I'll tell that in a moment. But anyway, so be careful to diversify. It's appropriate to want to become an expert in a tool. But if you're going to do this 30 years or more, things aren't going to stay the same. That's the rule, right? So you're in this full-time role for actually quite a few years, more than 10, sounds like, right? So and I also want to acknowledge our friend Eric King, and I've taken a couple of minutes to get back to this topic, but perhaps we should talk specifically about folks like Eric and what they do, because am I guessing right just from the timeline that around 99 might have been when you first met Eric, or not long after you started to go the consulting route? Is that fair?
Actually, Eric had worked. I had hired Eric's company as a consultant back in one of my full-time roles, and Eric was a fantastic consultant and helped my bank at that point get launched. And people who know Eric love Eric. And so that relationship continued on as I changed jobs and everything else. And so he created the modeling agency. You all should check that out. And under TMA, he was looking for more assignments, and he was able to create an amazing business model of no full-time staff, essentially, and being able to create opportunities for folks like us. So in your data science career, to find someone like an Eric who can help you find assignments and work as a subcontractor, wonderful option.
Could you help explain to everybody how that works? Sure. And how that helped you out at that point, right? Because you're forced into this move as this dramatic thing. I mean, it was kind of like your shutdown, right?
Yes.
It was comparable in how your life was turned around to how many of us felt in 2020. But you were going through this dramatic experience all by yourself, right?
Eric has amazing skills at business development and planning and strategy and helping clients see the big picture. And what he would do is he would do the biz dev, and he had an amazing Rolodex of people all over the industry. And then when they needed either someone to come out and do training for their firm or to do consulting, and by the way, I'm probably super duper oversimplifying this, but it'll at least get the idea across. He would place one of his stable of consultants to go help do the training and then provide wire support and then provide consulting for those clients. And sometimes those turned out to be very large engagements. Sometimes they were smaller, but essentially he was, if you can think of a brilliant recruiting agency for sort of short-time consulting, that was the model that he created and made a very successful business out of it. So,
yeah. So folks that are listening are probably more familiar with something, let's say, like crowdsourcing, right?
Yeah.
Where the relationship is all but anonymous and the gig is 2 weeks or whatever, right? But what we're talking about is decades long, and Eric just left a comment, but decades long relationships with clients and decades long relationships with consultants, and kind of matchmaking. Yes,
very important point.
So what people don't understand about this perhaps at first is they think, if I'm going to be, and let's just introduce some lingo that will only make sense in the US, but then we'll explain it, right? So when in the US, when somebody is on full-time salary, and I recognize that we're going to have an international audience, I'm sure, but when folks are on salary, we sometimes just kind of informally call them a W-2, because that's the form you get at the end of the year. And generally speaking, when you're on salary, when you're a W-2, you're doing about a 40-hour week, and usually there's a certain amount of exclusivity, that's assumed and so on, right? So now you find yourself in the situation you were when you had to move back to the mainland, and you had to make ends meet. So you're doing like a temp job. The feeling might be, wow, if I make that move, I'm completely alone. I'm completely on my own. And it's almost never the case, because what might happen is you might find one gig on your own that maybe is going to be 20 hours a week for 6 months. But maybe it's a really interesting gig. Maybe it's with exciting company for your logo cloud, and that's really great. But you go, wow, this is eventually going to end, or it's not the equivalent of full time. What am I going to do, right? And if you're early in your career and you're late 20s or early 30s or whatever, then maybe actually you're doing that one gig and then kind of secretly keeping the temp job or whatever. I mean, you're doing whatever you need to do eventually. But if you start to establish relationships with consultancies, you might have a relationship with multiple ones, and also finding clients on your own. Because if the folks out there are thinking, how the heck am I going to quit my job on a Friday and on Monday have a calendar full of gigs? Well, you're right to wonder that, because it doesn't.
You need to do more than wonder. You need to worry, because it does not work like that.
So companies like Eric's can be a lifesaver for someone who has holes in their calendar. And very often the conversation with a company like that is, I'd love to do a couple of months a year for you, because maybe that's what you have. Or then others might say, I'll take as much work as you have. And those kinds of relationships are absolutely critical. So would you have described yourself as a solopreneur at the time, even though when you're working through a company that's helping you find work, that's not quite the same as being a solopreneur? But I think it's the way most of us that have had years of solopreneurship end up doing it. We're finding some clients on our own. And then let me state what hopefully makes sense, but might not be clear at first, is that because you can't fill your calendar with only your own clients, and you reach out to this resource, it must be obvious to everybody that there's some rate differential there, where you're potentially earning more money with clients that you find on your own. And there's always some overhead that's involved when you're working through a consultancy. But you take all these sources of work and all these sources of income, and hopefully over the course of a rolling 12 months, it all works. So could you comment a little bit about, maybe not so much 99, but a little bit after that, when you're still in this mode and you're kind of working for yourself, but you're also collaborating with folks that are helping you find work? What was the mix of work like? What was that part of your career like?
So for the first couple of years, it was, let's say 99 to 2002, was primarily contract work. But one of the things I learned, two things I learned. One is that whether you like it or not, this field is about people. It's not about numbers. It's about solving real people's problems. It's about creating long-lasting, trustful relationships. It's about being part of a community. You need to do that regardless of the business form you take. I strongly suggest that for people starting out, it is much better to gain some experience in a corporate realm as a starting point, so that you can start to build your Rolodex, you can build your community, you can start to learn some basic skills. You have a name to be able to share with other people and demonstrate that you've done great work for. As I continued on from 2002, I continued with full-time roles, but I continued to contracting on the side to keep my sort of feet in that process, and to continue to gain experience and to meet new people and to gain new clients. And when I've had to, I've gone back to the full-time contracting roles. So I think that it is easier to take steps along the path. Corporate plus contracting to solopreneur. A lot of people like to paint the picture as the solopreneur lifestyle as being the ultimate. Everything has positives and negatives. And one of the things you really need to watch out for is simply explained as peaks and valleys. Keith, you were talking earlier about, 70, 80, 90-hour weeks sometimes that have to be done in consulting and contracting. That's true. I also spent about a year and a half living out of a Holiday Inn in New Jersey to be able to take care of my Bristol Myers Squibb client. And I think that was 70 to 90 hours a week. Wow. So wouldn't necessarily recommend that. No offense to either Holiday Inn or New Jersey.
Two follow-up questions to help, and I can guess. I can guess at this, but I think folks are listening and watching will really, need to understand this. So, when you found full-time employment that was well suited to you, you would take those opportunities at the time that you were doing contract work. But then when a good contract gig came along, you didn't want to turn it down. So you were doing both at the same time. And that's where you get like the 80 or 90 hour week. So in our ages, that's like harder to do, but that was the rationale at the time, right? So presumably you could pay the bills, the mortgage and the electric bill and all that was being paid from your salary. But I'm sure that part of the rationale of taking the gigs when they came along, even when you felt exhausted, was if you weren't doing that, you weren't maintaining a relationship with these companies that were giving you gigs and so on. You know what I mean? So especially early in your career, it's really hard to say no, isn't it? Because you don't, saying no, they might find somebody else and then you don't have them. So it's kind of like you got to suffer through the 80-hour weeks of doing both, or the whole process might stop. Or if there was a break in full-time employment and you've maintained these relationships, then you go, oof, I'll give myself one day off and then clear these gigs and start looking for more. So how did you do that in terms of your employer? They were aware of your additional work, I assume, right? So how did you navigate that, and how did you survive a big final presentation to a contract client? Did you occasionally have to take days off, for instance?
It was vacation, plain and simple. So there are two ways. One was vacation and sort of working after hours and weekends. And the other was I had to commute back and forth between Baltimore and DC by a series of trains, planes, and automobiles types of things to get back and forth. So I had 2 hours a day commute each way. And so all that time on the train or trains, I was working on the consulting pieces. And then for presentations in front of clients, and when you have to be on site, I took vacation. I'm not recommending that, but that's what I did.
So how many years of doing both full-time employment and contract work before you took full-time contract work, which again, in the US, we just informally say 1099 because that's the tax form you get when you're a contractor. How far along were you in this process before you spent a whole year or more, nothing but contract?
A long time. Over a decade. That's the short answer.
Well, and the beauty of that is, right, when you go, now that you're in the position where you either have a gig or you're not paying the bills, you can tell people and they can see it in your, it wasn't LinkedIn then, it might have actually been a PDF attachment, you send called a resume, which I don't know if folks
sometimes they were on a mystical substance called paper.
Well, yeah, mailing a resume. Yeah, of course I can send you my resume. I'll drop it in the mail tomorrow. Yeah, yes. That is not a conversation we have routinely anymore. But by the time, in other words, that your fiscal life relied upon contract work, you had been doing it in evenings and weekends for a decade. I think that's important for people to know. Yeah,
I think that people get very excited about the idea of becoming a solopreneur. And there's a time and a place and a situation where it's right. And there's several times and places and situations where it's not so right. Also, remember, if you take on a big contract and you're working 70, 80, 90 hours a week for some period of time, it is impossible to do that and do business development for the next contract at the same time. Or I found it impossible. I'm sure some people can pull it off, but I could not. So what would happen is I would work myself to death on a contract, and then the contract would come to an end. And then I didn't have anything lined up in the pipeline when I started out because I didn't have a very big network. So then I would kill myself the next period of time to get the next contract doing business development. So I was never not working an insane amount because I couldn't get a steady stream of doing both. That is a lot less romantic in practice than it is in your imagination. So, having those relationships, having those contacts, having those networks, having this sort of planned out, I do not recommend that people jump in with both feet until they have some of those pieces underneath, or I think you'll run into two problems. One, you won't be successful in your solopreneur, and also you'll be out of the workforce for a while trying to get back in if you decide to go back to the corporate route.
Okay, so I think, by the way, questions and comments, everybody, would be great. Please send your questions and comments, because we have, I think we've only gotten to our 30s in our stories. We have a long way to go, because what I want to do is I want to share with everybody a little bit about how I got to that decade of experience, so that I could sit down with a client and say, I've been doing this for more than 10 years. For Scott and I, it's been more like 30 now, but getting to that 5 years, 8 years, 10 years is really critical, because before that, you're going to be really nervous that you're going to have a great 3-month gig and then like nothing, right? And then the fear at that stage in your career is that the nothing could last for a long, long time, right? So let me briefly describe how I got to 10 years of experience, because our stories are a bit different in this respect, right? So in my late 20s, my career just really hadn't taken off. I had been doing some stats stuff. Actually, it's one of the reasons I get interested in psychometrics, is that I was a stats consultant for the research organization that studies the Myers-Briggs, that was founded by Isabel Myers herself. So that's a random thing that not very many people know about me. But for about 3 years, I was their SPSS guy, which was really kind of interesting. But the thing is, I thought it was really going to be a perfect part-time job to have for PhD work. But as part of that job, I really became, I had a brief, shoot me a comment, Scott, or anyone, if I briefly lost connection. I think
You did.
Fine now, but yeah, it looked like there was a refresh. Okay, great. So what happened is that I thought for sure that I was going to do like that grad school thing and do this consulting that I just described, as a part-time job, which they were very supportive of it. I could have done, 20 hours a week for them, like forever, probably. Well, I mean, at least at the time it seemed that way. And then what happened is I really got into SPSS. So I took some SPSS programming classes, and yes, SPSS has a programming language too, because my SAS friends would make fun of me. Oh yeah, SPSS is for the people who don't know how to program, But so I had to get through that teasing for a while. But then next thing you know, I was teaching these classes, and I was teaching 150, 180 days a year, okay, which was incompatible with PhD work, but that's what I was doing when I started doing consulting gigs. And the beauty of that is that 3 to 6 months out, I would be signing up, on the training calendar, and it was something that could be discussed and negotiated. So I had an advantage that it sounds like perhaps you didn't have at that stage of your career, which if it was just too much, I mean, if the 80-hour weeks were killing me, I could basically say, oh, I'll take the Chicago class, but if you've got somebody else to cover it, I might turn you down on the Cleveland, and Seattle classes or whatever, because I'm getting caught up on a project or something. And that was totally legit. Now, if I started saying, ooh, I need you to find somebody to cover the classes that you had allocated for me for like 2 or 3 months, then they would say, oh yeah, no problem, we'll call you in the 4th month, and the call would never come. So I never let that happen, but I could kind of control the rate of flow a little bit, and that was such a relief. So there were a few years there when I thought, this is like magical. This must be what it's always like, because I could, it was all 1099 income, all of it, right? And we haven't even talked about the tax implications of all your income being 1099, which we probably should, because I don't think everybody's going to understand that. And even though we probably have an international audience, I think the Americans at least have to have some idea of what the implications of that are. But I had a steady flow of work that I could control, and then I could take on gigs that I was excited about and build all these relationships. And that's how I got to the point where I could say, I've been doing this for 10 years, I've been doing this for 12 years, and so on. And then 2009 came. Now, 2009 wasn't dramatic like your story. You made a face like, what happened in 2009? 2009 was the year that IBM bought SPSS. And was it good? Was it bad? It was really kind of none of the above, but it created the kind of uncertainty in my personal life that your family emergency created in mine, in yours rather, and that shutdown created in all of our lives, right? Just not knowing, right? Now that I'm part of, rather than, I think SPSS had something like 1,000 employees, IBM has more like 400,000 or 500,000, right? We're talking completely different animals, right? I just didn't know what it meant. So when you were saying that back in the day, if you didn't know SaaS, there were certain gigs that you just weren't going to get. People weren't even going to treat you as competent, right? Well, I had built an entire career around SPSS, and I had chosen not to get the PhD. And I was terrified that no one outside the SPSS community was going to take me seriously. So I started planning my first book around that time. Now, it takes forever to get it done. So I was doing exactly what we told people not to do. Don't just have a dream of thought leadership or side hustle or whatever and wait until the crisis. But that's what I did. And whether it was a real or perceived crisis really doesn't matter. The point is, I felt uncertainty, right? So exactly. I said, wow, now that my future is uncertain, maybe I should write a book. Well, that's really hard to do on a bunch of levels. You can't rush a complicated project like that. And you also can't concentrate on writing if you're worried about paying the bills, right? So it just doesn't work. I should have, when I was feeling elated about, wow, contracting is so wonderful. That's when I should have been starting to write the book. But instead, I waited until my life was turned upside down. But thankfully, it was more a perceived crisis than a real one. And IBM, I was back to 80-hour weeks because I was training and consulting, and IBM was sending me all over the place, because when a 400,000 employee company buys a 1,000 employee company, there's not enough people that have the expertise of the 1,000 people. Right. And but I didn't know that. So then suddenly I'm back to the 80 hours, but somehow I managed to continue working on the book despite the crazy hours. I died that whole time in my life is like a blur, right? But then when some of my concerns about that were realized, and that, yes, I had this expertise that was valued, but now I'm part of such a big company. I'm not as limited a resource as I used to be after 2 or 3 years after the buyout. I said, wow, it's probably risky for me to tie all of my work and professional development and career to one brand. So the irony is, the SPSS book helped me branch out. That's the irony, because it was about SPSS.
Hey, Keith, Mohammed has a question in the comments you might want to take a look at.
Yeah, no, I love it. And then we can decide which one of us should
never
feel
mind.
it. Oh,
there you go.
I think StreamYard has magically placed the comment. Actually, we know who to thank. Thank you.
It's
Megan,
actually Megan, but yeah, we'll go with that.
Yeah. When is the right time to leave your full-time job and become a solopreneur? What are your thoughts on, Mohammed, could you clarify on what you mean by academy businesses? But I'm gonna throw this back at Scott, because I think we've ruled out don't wait until a crisis. In other words, don't wait until shutdown, a layoff, a family emergency, a buyout, right? That's not the right time. So when is the right time, Scott, would you say?
I think you have a balance that you're dealing with. And one is satisfaction in what you do in a traditional corporate role. And the other side of the balance is how sensitive are you to risk? You need to have your comfort with risk much higher than your level of satisfaction with a corporate job before you make that leap.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question that at first might sound like a serious question, but I think it's going to inspire both of us to chuckle a little bit.
Okay.
So when you decided, okay, I'm ready to be a solopreneur, did you have something like 6 months salary?
Keith, not
I'm
only
inspired
is Keith a gifted teacher,
right?
instructor, and consultant, he's secretly a comedian. No. Should I have? Yes.
Yeah, and my answer would be exactly the same. Did I take that precaution? No. Should I have? Yes. But I think most of us just I don't want to give an answer as vague as it felt right. I think it's at the point, both of us, I think, before we were full-time doing that, because even though I was a contractor teaching the classes, that was a steady gig. That was a 15-year gig. So it was structured much like a W-2 job, even though it was in fact a contractor 1099 job, right? So I had that stability. So you've got to have that stability in some form. Neither Scott and I had the stability with the financial planner, 6 months cash in the bank, but we had stability in other forms. And I think it's also fair to say, Scott, that by the time we felt comfortable telling a client, hey, I can really do this, I can run this project, I can do this for you, that we developed that confidence probably 2 or 3 or 5 years after a client would have trusted us to do it. But you know what I mean? Sometimes convincing yourself takes a little bit longer than convincing that. So certainly by the time that you feel that you can sit down with a client and say, yes, I can be in charge of this project that you want to have done. By the time you feel that, you probably are confident, because that first time you go in to run a project and you say, yeah, I'm ready to run the project. They go, well, how many of these have you done? And you have to come up with a phrase like, well, I've done similar things, and similar things meaning I've taught it or I've assisted on it or whatever. Did you have as rough a time with that first one as me? Like the very first time you're going to be like in charge. The client often assumes that you've done it like a dozen times, but you've got to somehow, you're bringing that confidence there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you've been the team leader or whatever it is. That first time is tough.
Yeah, part of the benefit that I had was I was named a corporate vice president at age 30 at a bank. So back in those days, that was quite an accomplishment. That was a big deal. But that's a very different set of skills than running a complete project for a client. So I think that my clients were convinced, because of the title that I had had in the past, that I was completely able to do this. But absolutely, imposter syndrome takes over early, powerful, and often like, okay, what have I gotten myself into? And that's kind of tricky. But I'm going to say something that most people disagree with, and that's okay. And it's called the benefits of abject terror. And what I mean by that is when I first started doing these projects as a contractor, I was scared to death. But I was scared to death of doing it wrong. So I tested everything. You know, people say, oh, well, the best technique for this is usually this. I go, and I test all of them. Oh, well, the absolute best way to look at this problem is just from this angle. Thank you very much. And I looked at all of them. And that sense of fear drove the adrenaline for me to be able to get much better at what I did and to actually be able to have the skills to run the project. I don't think that fear in general is a good idea. For me, that fear of failure drove me to become a much better data scientist and project runner than it would have otherwise.
Mohammed asked a follow-up question, and I think it's an insightful one. So thanks. Thank you.
Mohammed's an insightful person. He's so annoying. He says good comments all the time.
So here it is, right? We're not like teaching, mentoring, and courses. So again, that 15 years of almost nonstop training, right? So certainly I went that route. But how do you feel about somebody that maybe is working full-time? They'd love to do consulting gigs, but either they don't feel ready or the marketplace doesn't feel they're ready, and so on, right? Would you recommend to somebody like that maybe is in the first few years of their career getting a gig with one of these boot camps or something, helping the students with their code or whatever? I would actually think that somebody that is 3 to 5 years in their career should easily be able to get a job like that, I would think, right? Because it's just like when I got the SPSS job. I didn't have a ton of consulting experience, but I knew what to click on, right? So the equivalent in the coding world, I think that somebody could get a job like that. And even though it's different from consulting, it would be perceived in the marketplace as valuable experience. And I also think that when you explain something to others, it's an incredible,
thank you.
One, it's an incredible confidence boost, but it also forces you to stick your nose in the book and master it.
The other thing that it does is it forces you, let me back up. It's very difficult to unlearn what you already know and to put yourself back in the situation of before you knew it. When you deal with students and mentoring and carefully bringing people along, you're able to go back to that mindset. And a lot of times clients have lots of expertise in certain areas, but the reason why they bring you in is they don't have your expertise in this area. And learning how to be able to bridge that gap, to take people where they are, get them to where they need to be, and to make those connections. Teaching and consulting have a lot of similarities. So it makes you a better communicator. It makes you better at understanding client assignments in the future. It's fantastic. I also have a passion for it. I just love teaching. It was all good for me. So yes, I think that'd be a great idea.
Yeah, no, I think teaching is a great way to start. And again, I think consulting clients will recognize teaching as a credibility boost even more today than 20 years ago, because it tends to be so visible, like, writing a Udemy course or something like that. Would you agree, Scott, that probably, like when I was training, nobody knew who I was, but now, with my LinkedIn courses and stuff like that, my training becomes very visible. Yeah. So I think what we're basically saying, Mohammed, is that I think is a good way to go. And also there's always networking that's involved. What will happen when you're training is that you'll train 4 or 5, let's say new data scientists, and you'll think, well, I've got a class of, rookies that I'm training, and I find it very rewarding, but who in the industry is ever going to notice that? Well, their boss might, or their boss's boss might. So then next thing you know, you get some LinkedIn connection out of the blue from somebody's senior VP that says 8 people that work for me have been trained by you. And you go, wow, really? And say, we want to bring you in because they've been talking about all of the interesting things that you've said about K-nearest neighbors or whatever. And you go, really? Okay. And we have a project that we want you to lead, right? And you're nodding, Scott, because that it happens. That's not a once in a million thing. You know, I probably during those SPSS years easily 10, 15, 20,000 people over all those years because
Wow.
you know, it was a packed house every day. You know, the classes would last a couple of days and then other people would, you know, come in. It adds up.
Absolutely. Right? And the other thing is it allows you to give back. And I mean, give back, not just in terms of value, but teaching people to be able to have those skills and to be able to change their careers is an amazing feeling. And it is also a way that you have created value that's going to make a permanent difference in a human being's life. And to me, that's very important. And Keith, I think that's true for you as well.
Okay, so let's do a new topic, but an important one, and I want to make sure that we have time for it. So let's talk side hustle. How do you bring up the subject with your, now that we're at this stage in our career, and we never want to go from 80 hours to zero hours and 80 hours to 0 hours again. That hopefully is something that will literally never be something that we experience again, like at this stage. Like for instance, at shutdown, for a few months, I lost all my conference work, but I've got 6 or 7 data science related sources of income. So yes, it was, hey, sit down for a moment, collect your thoughts. What does this mean for my income this year? What am I going to do about it? Yes, there was that moment like everybody else, but it was not a, I might have no income this year moment. That I knew wasn't a possibility. So I think we fluctuate less than we used to. It used to be feast or famine, and now it's might be erratic like anyone that has entrepreneurial stuff. So how do you bring up the subject with side hustle with your employers when you go the full-time route? And what kind of side hustle have you worked in?
Well, it's interesting. One of the very powerful restrictions at Booz Allen, where I just left, was that side hustles were not encouraged. Now, they did encourage people to be able to do things like if you were doing tutoring, they were all for that. If you were just teaching a class at a school, they were all for that. They did not like side hustles outside of that. And it was their dime. I was working for them, their call, I got it. But when I decided to leave Booz Allen, I realized that I didn't have the side hustles in place anymore. So in Booz Allen, because it's a large company, it's almost 31,000 employees, they had a formal process for applying. I do not recommend hiding this stuff. I think that you need to have an open, honest conversation. And if your employer says, no, you can't do that, you have some decisions to make. You know, can you go for another employer who does allow you to do side hustles? You do not want to get caught. I tend to be a bit of a Boy Scout in terms of trying to be honest all the time anyway, but that is not a situation you want to be in.
Well, I mean, first, I completely agree. Being less than forthcoming about it is a horrible idea. Because, I mean, imagine the scene of, you know, you get called in on the carpet and they say, Scott, I thought we agreed that you weren't going to do this. We've read your tweets, right? Promoting your conference workshop.
Finally, someone read my tweets and it has to be my employer.
I thought, you know, Scott, I thought you said you were going to Dubai on vacation. Well, the event is in Dubai and I am taking vacation, but yes, I'm leading you know, a workshop or whatever. So it's just crazy to even contemplate it. So please, everybody, don't even consider doing that. But would you, in an interview, I'm sensing that you would bring it up sooner rather than later, and you might weigh that in your decision to accept the position. Am I right?
I have very specific thoughts on this particular one, and that is, if they ask you, you need to answer the question and you need to be forthright and you need to deal with it. If they don't ask the question, you wait until you're up to the point where you're discussing the offer, where they have put an offer on the table. And then you say, great, here's what I need to make my side of this equation work. I need to be able to write articles. I need to be able to do this. I need to be able to do that. If you address those issues before there's an offer on the table, you were just creating static and limiting your chances for getting that job.
Yeah, my answer would be different, and I don't disagree. I don't disagree with your
Sure.
rationale. I probably could be described as slightly salary phobic. Okay. I really prefer, I mean, all these years, I mean, if you start since undergrad, I don't even want to count, but let's say roughly, because you have jobs at first that you look back and they felt like jobs at the time, but they don't feel like jobs now. Everybody has that in their in their careers. But let's say it's 30 years. The amount of time that I've had any W-2 income over those 30 years is probably only about 3 or 4. And I sense that you're probably the other way.
I'm the flip of that.
Had salary, salary 80% of the time, and I probably had it 20% of the time, right? So I'm somewhat full-time phobic, right? Because I like this 7 or 8 things cooking all at the same time. I have 2 books at the same time at the moment, which I don't recommend. But that's what happens when you're really trying very hard to have 6, 7, 8 plates spinning at the same time. You'll sometimes have them overlap, right? So I bring it up quite early. And it actually is kind of an interesting one to end on, because I've had 2 experiences now. I'm currently in one, and I'm very happy with the situation where I negotiated part-time, specifically because I said that not only are the LinkedIn learning courses not going to stop, I want to continue to record them. I want to continue to fly out to Santa Barbara 4 times a year, or whatever they want me to do. And yes, I want to speak at TDWI, where I was this week, and I want to continue to do things and maintain relationships with folks like with Eric, who joined us today. And say, that's going to take up half my time. So I'm upfront that this is a deal breaker, and it's got to be half time. And 2 organizations have said, even under those circumstances, we want to work together. Let's just make sure that your activities outside that the affiliation is real, that this isn't just a gig to you. This is a real, a corporate affiliation, which in both cases it very much was. Certainly that was my feeling about it. But that also, let's make sure that there's no conflict of interest between your salary activities and otherwise. And it's surprisingly easy to do it, because it's not like training and conference speaking is the service product of the kinds of companies that we would be working for as data scientists. So I think generally what you have to do is where it gets a little tricky is consulting, both full-time and part-time. I'm sure that was tricky at times, but we're nearly at the end. Let's, if there's one question, help us out, everybody. If there's one more thing I can have Scott comment on. I knew this hour was going to go by quickly, but we hit some of the main things. When do you have the confidence to do some contracting? How do you get started? How do you pay the bills? We never talked about taxes, but taxes are not a fun topic anymore.
To discuss or to pay.
Well, I guess both. But the quick version is the tax situation is tough on contractors. Would you think it's fair to say? In the United States, it's Social Security tax, basically. Just Google double FICA, and you'll learn all about it. You basically pay double Social Security tax when you're a contractor, because you're paying it as both employee and employer, because you're self-employed. And you've obviously, I'm sure, experienced that, Scott. It really can be tough. I mean, it can really add up to be a lot of money, right? Covering tax and benefits on your own. Would you think that? Would you say that's
that is absolutely true, and that is why jumping into this is not a good idea. Meaning, not thinking it through. You really need to have a plan. You need to sit down and talk to a financial planner in terms of what all those elements are. so that when you're making a decision, you know what number you're making those decisions on. A lot of people don't think it through and then get surprised, and that can be a disaster.
Well, and you were supporting a family. I'm single without kids. So that's probably one of the reasons why I've felt that I was able to choose full-time contracting when frankly, most of my friends and colleagues probably favor full-time because the benefits can also get so expensive. And benefits, we're just talking about benefits as an individual. Benefits for a family can be really tough. Now, of course, a contractor might have a spouse that provides the benefits for the family. But anyway, that could be a whole show. In fact,
maybe
actually, it really could be a whole show. I could find somebody.
He wasn't being rhetorical there,
a fellow
folks.
LinkedIn learning instructor, maybe somebody with an HR specialty. Oh, if you're out there in the world, probably hearing this and recording, make yourself known. If you can speak to the logistics of being, a contractor in a way that I can't as an HR professional or as a tax professional, I am seeking you out because I think a whole episode on that would be great. So I've really enjoyed talking about this. I hope this was helpful. I think we've discovered, Scott, that there was a lot more than an hour to talk about. We probably could have done just an hour on side hustle or just an hour on when you're ready to be a consultant. And instead, we tried to talk about 2 careers from start to finish. So we may have been enough more than we could chew, but I hope it was entertaining.
Thank you so much for including me, Keith. This really means a lot to me, and I had a great time. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm glad. And thanks, Eric and Mohammed and Vincent, for joining and throwing out all kinds of interesting comments and questions that we were able to incorporate into the talk today. I try to do these every month. Please follow me on, in fact, I've committed to doing it every month. So one way or another, I'm going to do it. We're certainly going to have one in March. At the moment, I think it's going to be Ian Barkin. So Ian, if you're out there, I hope you remember that we were talking about doing this in March. I will be reaching out. Thanks, everybody. See you next month.